Why Nations Fail by Daron Acemoglu and James A. Robinson. The main cause of economic inequality and underdevelopment is political institutions. Economic hardship is not the result of physical factors like geography or culture, but is caused when political leaders in underdeveloped nations implement exploitative policies that impoverish their own people. For example, the city of Nogales is half in Mexico and half in the United States. Citizens on the U.S. side of the border are wealthier, healthier, and better educated than the people on the Mexican side. One half of Nogales citizens suffer not because of its geography, but because of the political differences between the two nations. The United States is wealthier because it has a history of well-established democratic pluralist institutions that encourage technological innovation, which in turn makes the whole population wealthier. Mexico, on the other hand, historically has had undemocratic, extractive institutions which take wealth from the population and give it to the elites. These historical institutions tend to have long-lasting consequences on nations' development, even after they have been overthrown. Governments need to provide basic security, education, and property rights before development can happen. However, oftentimes political elites do not want to encourage development because it will disrupt their own hold on wealth and power and threaten their authority. Therefore, simply giving underdeveloped nations foreign aid will not be enough to solve their problems. Development cannot take place and poverty cannot be eradicated until democratic, pluralist institutions take the place of extractive institutions, which exploit their own people and prevent economic growth and development. Political institutions, not geography and climate, are responsible for nations' development and prosperity. Over the course of history, many academics have argued that successful societies have arisen as a result of the lack of climate and geography. Moderate climates that have fertile soil will give rise to prosperous societies, while areas that are subject to storms and poor farming conditions will give rise to less successful societies. Some theorists have even argued that it is not only the climate, but the innate industriousness and temperament of the people who live in these climates that leads to successful society. However, these claims do not hold up to historical scrutiny. In the tropical Americas, for example, great empires like the Aztecs grew and developed into very prosperous cultures. In a more recent example, North and South Korea have the same geography and climate and a shared culture until the middle of the 20th century. But nowadays, North Korea is poor and underdeveloped, while South Korea prospers. In Central America, Costa Rica is much more prosperous than its neighbor Nicaragua, boasting a GDP per capita in 2013 of $13,570 compared to Nicaragua's $4,510 per capita. Costa Rica is one of the most prosperous countries in the Americas, while Nicaragua is one of the poorest. As a result, many Nicaraguans cross the border into Costa Rica, and between 350,000 and 500,000 Nicaraguan immigrants live in Costa Rica. Clearly, the difference in prosperity and development between the neighboring countries is not the result of climate or geography. Governments, not geography, are the most important factor in determining if a country will prosper or be mired in poverty. For example, North Korea is a dictatorship, which deliberately keeps its citizens exploited and impoverished by extracting wealth from them. Dictatorial governments lead to stagnant economies. Pluralist institutions, on the other hand, such as the one in South Korea, encourage innovation and development, which leads to thriving economies and successful citizens. Spain was a dictatorship until 1975, when its military dictator, Francisco Franco, died. Rather than continue to rule as a monarch, his successor, King Juan Carlos I, decided to implement a representative democracy in Spain. He held parliamentary elections and instituted a new constitution. He also allowed unionization and encouraged a more equitable distribution of resources. As a result of these new laws, the prosperity and wealth of the Spanish people grew. Innovation began to grow, and the economy soared. From the late 1970s to 2015, Spain increased its economic output times 10. Exports and tourism increased. Their per capita income rose from $3,000 to $30,000, and as a result, more people immigrated into the country, raising their population from 10.4 million to 46.4 million. Historical conditions influence political institutions. Certain historical events can shape a nation's political development. Democratic institutions may arise in some places and not others simply as a result of historical accidents. For example, democracy was able to grow in England because its merchant class gained a significant amount of power in 1588 after the British defeated the Spanish Armada, which empowered British trade. However, the British were victorious largely as a result of luck. Storms and the accidental death of a Spanish commander tipped the scales in their favor, but their victory led to a booming merchant class that could challenge the aristocracy and ultimately created conditions where democracy could grow. However, some people subscribe to what's known as the Whig interpretation of history. This term describes the tendency some historians have to view history in terms of a continual story of progress that eventually leads to the glorification of the present day. Through this lens, the world is viewed as a place where there used to be less freedom and virtue in the past, and continual progress has consistently led to the development of more virtue and freedom. This implies that progress is not only inevitable, but it will continue on well into the future. However, this is not necessarily true. History is not continually progressing, and freedom is not even necessarily the direct result of progress. Democracy and freedom often come about as the result of historical accidents and luck, such as the British victory over the Spanish Armada. They are not inevitable, and continual progress and freedom is not guaranteed. Historical circumstances could just as easily change the course of history the other way. For example, during the 14th century, the Black Death greatly reduced England's labor force. Therefore, laborers became more valuable, and their wages rose to reflect that. This gave them more wealth and power than they had previously had, and helped create an environment where pluralist institutions like the ones in modern England could develop. On the other hand, small Eastern European towns were firmly controlled by the aristocracy, who repressed workers' rights and kept their wages down. Even when the Black Death reduced the worker population, the aristocracy was able to continue to exploit workers, which led to the strengthening and continuation of an exploitative, extractive economic system. Future catastrophes, such as climate change, are likely to have similar economic ripple effects. For example, if climate change leads to flooding in coastal areas, but more fertile soil in others, some populations will benefit from improved economic conditions, while others will suffer. As some populations become more empowered, power hierarchies will change. Other people, however, will only become further exploited as the elites capitalize on uncertainty and suffering. A catastrophe like climate change will have far-reaching impacts, and the resulting outcomes will come about as a result of the different institutions and varying levels of development that are already in place in certain areas of the world. All political institutions reinforce themselves. Pluralist institutions perpetuate themselves in cycles. Once a pluralist institution is established, it perpetuates a system where people are empowered to petition the government for reforms. As people insist on more reform, the strength of a representative democracy grows, and repressive measures are decreased and weakened over time. On the other hand, extractive institutions also perpetuate themselves in repeating cycles. Once elites have secured their status at the top of the hierarchy, it is very hard to break up that concentration of power. For example, Russia was a monarchy for over 300 years. While the Bolshevik Revolution ended the rule of absolute monarchy, it imposed even more repressive, restrictive, and undemocratic practices, and leaders murdered millions of people who dared to dissent. In 1989, representatives were elected, but the supposedly democratic institutions were corrupt. Today, Russia still is not truly free and democratic. Instead, it remains under the control of an authoritarian president, Vladimir Putin. He continues to use his power to extract wealth from his citizens for his own personal enrichment, and the Russian people continue to have to deal with the consequences of living under extractive political institutions. Weak governments and authoritarian governments will not succeed in the long run. Nations that do not have a strong central authority will ultimately fall victim to warring factions, each of which will exploit the people living under them. If a state cannot provide basic security for its citizens, then crime will increase and people will suffer. Basic safety, security, and property rights are essential for a nation's development, and without it, people will become impoverished. In fact, according to a 2011 World Development Report, violence and conflict are some of the main reasons countries devolve into poverty. Cycles of violence create repetitive cycles of poverty as weak governments give rise to civil wars and continued violence over long periods of time. For example, a total of 39 countries that experienced a civil war between the years of 1970 and 2000 also experienced a civil war between 2000 and 2011. These wars led to alarming rates of poverty, malnourishment, and doubled rates of infant mortality. But poverty cannot be cured without first solving the problem of continuous cycles of violence. However, weak governments are not the only governments that will ultimately fail. Authoritarian governments also cannot succeed in the long term. Authoritarian, extractive governments have a lot of power over their economy, so they can move resources around to encourage growth in specific sectors. For example, the Soviet Union was able to grow its economy through centralized industrialization until 1970, when development essentially stagnated. In the long term, extractive governments kill the innovation that is necessary for long-term productivity and development, and the economy will eventually stall. Many economists believe China is experiencing a similar situation now. Its economy has been growing impressively, but will soon face stagnation if the government does not move towards more open, pluralist institutions. In 2015, China's growth rate dropped to 6.9%, its lowest in 25 years. Because the Chinese government has been known to be secretive about these numbers, it is possible the economy's real growth rate is actually even lower. China's manufacturing industry suffered, and stock markets and increasing debt further hurt their economy. The Chinese attempted to stimulate the economy by pumping money into infrastructure, but these attempts may prove to be futile if they have similarly reached the same point of authoritarian stagnation that the Soviet Union reached in 1970. Foreign aid is not a cure-all. Economists sometimes behave as though simply distributing knowledge and funds are the keys to solving underdevelopment. However, the main cause of poverty is not a lack of expertise or money, so foreign aid will not do much to help underdeveloped countries in the long run. Nations are made poor because of extractive political institutions, and these institutions will continue to exploit and extract wealth from their citizens. They will also find ways to use foreign aid money to enrich themselves and will do nothing to help relieve the poverty of their people. Therefore, foreign aid is not necessarily the most effective way to end poverty. For example, between 2002 and 2012, the United States gave Colombia $6 billion of foreign aid to help fight against the crimes of drug trafficking and terrorism that were greatly harming the country. Instead, Colombia's president, Álvaro Uribe, used the United States' resources to target his political enemies and further strengthen his own hold on wealth and power. Under Uribe's rule, Colombia became less democratic and less stable. Colombia's people did not benefit from foreign aid, and the end result was actually the opposite of what the United States had intended. The main takeaway: a strong democratic government is necessary to maintain long-term economic development. Weak central governments will lead to fracturing, civil war, and poverty, while authoritarian governments will ultimately stagnate. Pluralist institutions encourage innovation and economic growth, while extractive institutions exploit their citizens, stifle innovation, and lead to underdevelopment. Because underdevelopment is not the result of a lack of funds or knowledge, but is caused by extractive institutions and exploitative and corrupt elites, foreign aid and resources will not solve the problems of underdevelopment and poverty until the underlying issues with a nation's political institutions are fixed.
Hi, I'm Rhonda, and this is an exclusive audiobook video recorded for the Audiobook Master Channel. Enjoy your audiobook and have fun learning. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification button so you'll get updated on our next upload. If you liked the video, give us a thumbs up and say your thoughts about the book we just covered. Do you want to listen to a summary or review of a book that we haven't covered in the past? Say it in the comments below or send us a message. Don't forget to check our other uploads. Enjoy listening!